All right, so let's get things started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Oxplore Book Club live event for October, which I'm delighted to say is the first of our autumn series. Very exciting times. My name is Sam. I'm a second-year engineering student at University College here in Oxford. This is not my first time presenting here at Oxplore. If you came to some of our summer series, you might remember me from presenting the talks on Unstoppable and the New World. But equally, if this is just your first time here at an Oxplore Book Club live event, we hope you will have a great time. So we have a very exciting session for you lined up today, which will include an opportunity for you to send in your questions to our special guest, Tess Johnson, who has just popped into video now. Plus, by attending today, you've all been entered into a prize draw to win the Arc of a Scythe trilogy of books. I'm going to announce the winner of that at the end of our event today. So if you have any ideas or questions for Tess at any point, please do pop them in the Zoom chat, and then we will give those a look, and hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions. So Tess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks for that, Sam. So hello to everyone. It's great to be here today. My name is Tess Johnson, and I'm a doctoral student and a researcher at the Oxford Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics. So I do the ethics of new biotechnologies and human reproduction and genetics, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you today.
Very nice. So before we get started about talking on Scythe, we have a quick Halloween-themed quiz. You know, it's the 20th of October, nearly Halloween. Let's get in the spirit of things. So our first question is about Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. So the main character is called Nobody, but why is he called this? So answer A, is it because he looks like nobody but himself? Answer B, is it because he's an orphan and therefore belongs to nobody? Or answer C, because when he is asked who he is, he replies, nobody. The answer to this one is actually A, because he looks like nobody but himself. So although Nobody, or Bod as he's sometimes known, is Northern, he's named Nobody because when the ghosts who agree to care for him for the first time meet him, they discuss who he thinks he looks like. And his new mother thinks he looks like nobody but himself. His name sounds very much like Nobody Owns, but Nobody Owens, in fact, has a full graveyard of ghostly friends who he fits in very well with. All right, on to question 2. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, which of these can't a vampire do? Is it A, cross water, B, go out in daylight, or C, be seen in a mirror? The answer to this one is C. Dracula can't be seen in a mirror. So it's in stories about vampires, obviously going out in the sunlight either weakens their powers or sometimes even kills them entirely. Dracula can also cross water, but only at high or low tide, yet he can't be seen in a mirror, which shocks the protagonist of the book at first. On to our third question. So in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, what is the name of the monster that is created from the human body parts? I realized I nearly spoiled the answer there. So the answer to this one is actually B. He doesn't have a name. That's one of the most popular misconceptions in literature, is that the monster is Frankenstein, but actually it's Frankenstein's monster because Dr. Frankenstein created the monster. A bit tough to wrap your head around, but once you've read it a couple of dozen times, it starts to make sense. And some people call the monster Adam, although that's very much just a way that people have chosen to interpret it because it's maybe a little catchier than just calling him the monster. On to our next question. In the first novel of the Cirque du Freak series by Darren Shan, what kind of animal does Darren steal? Is it A bat, B, a snake, or C, a spider? Now, we do have a clue, which is that the book is about the world of vampires. However, I might add that the clue is actually a bit of a red herring. Let's reveal the answer. The answer is actually C. It is a spider. Again, bit of a red herring. You would expect it to be bats because it's a vampire-themed book series. Not actually the case. So it's a giant spider called Madame Octa that Darren becomes obsessed with and steals from these Cirque du Freak shows. And that helps to put the plot into motion initially. One last question. What saying, inspired by a famous spooky story, is used to refer to a person who switches between very good and very bad behaviour? Is it A, Dr. Forster's character, B, a Jekyll and Hyde character, or C, a Mr. Scrooge character? Okay, so I can reveal that the answer is, in fact, B. It's Jekyll and Hyde. So Dr. Faustus and Ebenezer Scrooge are certainly very interesting characters who do have plenty of dealings with the supernatural, but Jekyll and Hyde inspires this phrase because Dr. Jekyll is very much a well-respected man in wider society, whereas Mr. Hyde is the complete opposite. He is evil, he's dangerous, and the whole point of Jekyll and Hyde is exploring the duality of man and how people can both have a very respectable and positive side, but equally have these dark sensibilities locked away. All right, so that concludes our quiz. On to the next part. So, Tess, would you like to give us a bit of a talk about what you think about Scythe and some of the bioethical issues and the questions that jumped out to you when you first read it?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Sam. So I really enjoyed reading this book. I got, well, to tell the truth, I got about 3/4 of the way through before it was overdue at the library. But I thought it was brilliant. And Neal Shusterman has a history of doing these fantastic books, which are, you know, a bit sci-fi. We're wondering, could this be our future? They're a little bit dystopian. And they're really special in my area because they bring up so many important ethical questions and in just a really fun way to get to talk and think about them. So the ones that I identified in Scythe, of course, it's a lot about living in the future and what it means when people have become immortal, essentially, and when the only way that people actually die is by gleaning by scythe. And I think that that brings up so many questions about whether or not we should do this in the future. You know, we could potentially, with further scientific advances, have the possibility to make ourselves immortal in the future. And there might be some great reasons why we would want to do that. We can see in the book Scythe that a lot of the world's problems have been solved. You know, there's enough food to go around. There's everyone's doing jobs that they like. They have a really good standard of living. And part of that is to do with their longevity, as well as to do with this kind of all-powerful thunderhead that looks after everyone. But I think that Neal Shusterman raises some really important questions about whether immortality is entirely a good thing too. So he talks about how people's lives seem to have lost meaning, and there aren't any jobs that people want to do that actually are necessary and needed. And it seems like a lot of people almost lose the will to live when they can actually live forever. They can't necessarily find as much fulfillment. And I think what that makes us question about ourselves is, what kind of a meaning does death bring to life? And is it necessary to have death in order for us to stay motivated and to stay compassionate and empathetic towards other people too? Because it seems like if there's no death at the end of a life, then we have forever to put things off and to procrastinate and to make up for when we've hurt people, maybe. So kind of what's the point of anything? I think Neal Shusterman does a really good job at identifying that. One of the other important ethical issues that I think he brings up is to do with this omnipotent AI and like this idea of, okay, you have all of this knowledge out there and people don't even care about it that much anymore. They know that they're provided for. And there's this question about, okay, if we could be looked after by something like the thundercloud, should we want to? Should we let artificial intelligence get that far?
Thank you very much, Tess. Those are some really interesting points. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to any questions that we've had in the chat. I'm going to start off with a quick question for Tess, and that is, what kind of books do you like to read in your spare time?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. This was actually perfect. This is exactly the kind of book that I like to read in my spare time. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to dystopia. And my mum is actually a librarian. So when I was growing up, I had an endless stack of books that were all about scientific dystopia on my bedside table. And I think the key ones that I would have to recommend that are along the same lines as Scythe, and what I like to read as well, would have to be The Hunger Games. I'm sure that a lot of people here have read The Hunger Games and probably have a similar appreciation for just how well it talks about, what the world could turn into if it goes awry. And I think that another one is called The Uglies series by Scott Westerfield. And The Uglies series by Scott Westerfield is on a similar issue, and one that's related to my research too. It's about what happens if we could enhance future people physically and cosmetically. And if we ended up with a world full of designer people, should we enhance humans in the future? And what might be the outcomes of doing that if people could be essentially super people whenever they wanted to? So that's another one of my favorites. And I think that in the style, it's pretty similar to Scythe, and people here might really enjoy it.
Very nice. So we just had our first audience question, and that's from Annabelle. And she wants to know if you think there are some similarities between Scythe and Animal Farm, for context, George Orwell's very popular book, in case some of our viewers haven't heard of it before.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Annabelle. And that's another, classic of this type of literature that I think is a really good one to bring up. So in Animal Farm, a lot of the questions are about relationships between different, maybe different types of people with political views that are represented as different animals. And there's this idea that one group of animals has a problem with another group of animals, and they take them over, and they seem to try to replace this system that's not working on the farm. But in the end, they've replaced it, or they're taking over the humans, aren't they? And in the end, they've replaced the system with one that works essentially just as badly. And I'm not sure that Scythe deals with exactly the same stuff, but I think there's a lot here. Maybe what you're getting at, Annabelle, is this idea that the Scythes seem to have taken over a lot of the political forces that maybe governments performed in the past, and they're kind of this bureaucratic thing that doesn't necessarily work that well with their their annual meetings and things. So yeah, maybe it seems like one system that wasn't working so well on that human planet has just been replaced by the Scythe system that also has a lot of problems too. So it's a really good one to bring up.
Yeah, I would also say that from my own perspective, I think there's a bit of an overlap in terms of Scythe is about, like, eventually humans have achieved utopia in many senses. People can live forever. If you're hurt, then you can be healed. But obviously there is still immense dissatisfaction. And Animal Farm, I do think you could argue there's a bit of a link there, because the whole point is the animals overthrow the humans trying to build, again, like I said, something better. And it turns out to have some pretty big shortcomings. So thank you for that question. Our next question comes from Bourne Grammar School. And that is, do we think that privacy is an important theme? And does the book hold any lessons for our own society?
Brilliant. Okay, thanks to the Bourne Grammar School students. Yeah, I think that privacy is another big question here. It's one that I hadn't actually thought of yet. I guess it's one of the themes that comes out more slowly in the book, to do with, everyone's data is in the Thunderhead. And I think that there are a lot of questions there about, okay, you can access CCTV of anyone, and the Thunderhead will help you to access as much data as it wants to help you access. So in a world where there's surveillance everywhere, and where you're constantly being watched by this essentially overlord, even if it's a good overlord, there are a lot of questions there about, okay, well, do we value privacy for its own sake? Or do we only value privacy if it prevents bad things from happening? Because if the Thunderhead is going to make sure that nothing happens, that's bad from the sharing of that data, then maybe it's not a problem. But if we think that privacy is valuable in and of itself, then it seems like there might still be some privacy issues there. So I think it really depends on why you think privacy is important.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. Thank you. And on a related note, Navia wants to know, why do we think that the Thunderhead does not actually control the Scythedom? Because it controls nearly everything else in the society, but the Scythedom is the one thing that humanity has said it wants to manage itself.
Yeah, I think that's another really good question. I wonder if, I'd love to hear other people's opinions on this if they're interested in putting them on the chat, but I wonder if the reason for that is because death is something that's so human, and maybe something that, an artificial intelligence couldn't necessarily understand that well. I can understand how, if you want to make sure that you're creating an artificial intelligence like the Thunderhead that is safe and that doesn't pose a risk to humans, you would leave the death of humans kind of to the people. It's something that's so amazingly human and that machine can't experience itself. So maybe that's the thinking along the lines of leaving that one realm to humans.
There's also actually at the minute, for our viewers, if they're interested, quite recently there was an AI that was launched that you can input moral questions in, and it will give you a judgment of whether it thinks that this is morally acceptable. I think the AI is called Delphi, in case there's something you want to Google after this session. But it's an interesting idea because AI and moral judgments is something that's very hard. Morality is something that's really human. So can computers really deal with it? It's a big question.
Yeah, that is a really big question. I hadn't heard about that yet, Sam, but that's kind of terrifying from a philosopher's point of view.
Admittedly, the data set that this AI is working with is probably not the best. Sometimes you get some you get some questionable verdicts. But again, who's to say that in future, if you did roll an AI like that out, it might still have strange things in the data set that mean it occasionally behaves a bit weirdly.
Yeah.
So our next question comes from Damien. Scythe is a really dark and interesting book. Do you think that achieving immortality is possible through your own learning and research? And if why or why not, can you justify that?
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think this is one that I can attempt to answer. I am not a biologist anymore, but I did do some biology in my undergrad, and some of the work that I do now is on human enhancement. And one of the types of human enhancement that is being looked at currently are things that improve human health. So making us immune to catching diseases, for instance, is something that you can possibly do to people genetically, and so that you can ensure that they won't be susceptible to catching diseases in the future. What I'm talking about at the moment isn't feasible yet. It's not really safe or effective, but it's something that scientists are starting to think about, at least, and try to work on. We've also got other ways. We already know that there are ways we can change our lifestyles that make us live longer. And so I think that whilst we'll probably never be entirely immortal the way that Scythe shows us to be, I would say that there's so much that we can do and that is being explored as to how we can slowly increase our lifespan. So, I mean, I suppose there's a very big difference between living forever and living for, say, 200 years. But I think that as we get further and further along, that's when these questions start to arise. Some of them still apply. If you're only going to die in 200 years, how would you use your first 100 years? Would you do much with them, or would you just kind of have a really good time and then leave all of the work to the second 100 years? I don't know.
And on a semi-related note to immortality, something more philosophical than technical, Eva wants to know if you personally like or dislike the idea of immortality.
Was that Ida?
Eva.
Eva, thank you, Eva. Yeah, I personally, I'm not convinced. I really already worry about I think that death can be quite meaningful, and I really worry about my own motivation and ability to make sure that I'm, thinking about other people and living my life to the best way that I can. And I think that if I had all of that time, I wouldn't know what to do with myself. And I think that having a limit to life is for me, at least, just for me, is what kind of helps me to think about what I want to do with that time and how I can spend it as well as possible. So I think, there's a lot that's, as you were saying, Sam, there's a lot that's like a utopia in Scythe, but I think that aspect is still definitely dystopian for me.
Yeah, and I also think, just from my own personal perspective, I think it comes down a lot to what you believe or don't believe may happen after death. For example, I think I personally find the idea of immortality quite interesting, just because, death is such an unknown, whereas life is very much a known. But it's something that is completely down to your own ethical judgments, and something you could have a really good discussion about in a class.
Yeah.
So the next question comes from, do you think the Scythes are a bit like the world's police?
Oh, I think that's a really good question, Connor. I think that the Scythes function like police in some ways. It seems like the Thunderhead does a lot of that work, kind of preventing crimes from happening. And you have a lot less crime anyway in a society where everyone kind of has everything they need. But I guess the threat of gleaning, even though it's not actually done retributively, it's not actually done in response to people committing crimes. I think that from the way that Neal Shusterman presents it, it sounds like the threat of that and the fear of gleaning is at least part of what motivates people to act well. So maybe the Scythes are kind of performing a dual role there. They're letting people be afraid that they might be gleaned if they do something wrong, just to help keep people on track.
Very good. So our next question is also about Scythes, but much more about our two main characters, Citra and Rowan. And Navia, again, wants to know, who do you think was better and more suited to being a Scythe out of our two main characters?
Wow. Great questions, Navia. So for this one, I think that's really hard to tell. And I mean, don't give it away spoilers, because I don't even know who it was. I've got to get this book back from the library, renew it, and read the end of it. But I think that the key thing about both Rowan and Citra was that Scythe Faraday chose them because they were they had very strong moral compasses. And the idea was that neither of them wanted to kill, neither of them wanted to be in this situation. And that was what was going to make them good Scythes. Because to glean, death is being treated here as something that should happen with dignity and without fear, in the opposite way to the way that some Scythes were practicing it in the book. And so I think this idea that the way to give people a death that is without fear and that is with dignity, and maybe that is a good death, is by choosing people as Scythes like Citra and Rowan, who are going to make sure that this is something that is done meaningfully and respectfully.
Yeah, another thing I found very interesting when I had a bit of a peruse through the book is that Scythe Faraday sort of tries to make each person have a unique death, because I think when I first started the book, I thought it might be quite standardized, but no, it's very much up to the individual Scythe discretion. And I find that quite interesting. Again, it's maybe about how death is, in its own sense, a personal experience and not something that could just be rolled out en masse, like a pill or something. But yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. So the next question again comes from Born Grammar. And do we think that it is good for being a Scythe to be a desirable job?
Wow. I mean,
we're getting all the heavy-hitting moral questions today.
Heavy-hitting questions.
Again, thank you so much, chat. Keep these questions coming in.
Definitely, they're brilliant. I mean, when you think about the people that have control over death in our everyday lives, we're starting to see a shift towards death being possible by euthanasia. So that's when a doctor helps someone who is very old and who wants to pass away and who's in a lot of pain to do that. And I think that there's nothing that I would say that means that people these days shouldn't want to be doctors, and maybe even doctors who specialize in euthanasia. I don't know if that's a thing, but if it is, then I would say that there's nothing wrong with wanting to help people through that period of life. Maybe being a Scythe, though, is a little bit different because that's your only function and because death isn't necessary and kind of coming for these people anyway. So yeah, I think that's one that you guys might have to, decide for yourselves upon further discussion.
So our next question comes from Samantha. Citra says that she thinks it's no surprise that people bend over backwards to please the Scythes. Hope in the shadow of fear is the world's most possible motivator, I think would be the quote. How do you feel about that? Would you agree or disagree?
I think that that's one of the really problematic things about the Scythes. This idea that, I mean, it's when we were talking about this police question before, it seems like it's an important part of making sure that people behave well, that they're afraid of gleaning and they think that maybe it'll be associated with them not doing the right thing. But I think that there's something really unfair about this idea, and really sad if in this futuristic society, people think that the people who have more to offer, the people who can give away their really fancy mansion, can actually, buy longer without dying than the people who don't have as much to offer. Because when we think about what it means, that people are going around thinking, oh, well, that person has more to offer a Scythe than I do. If it was between me and him, then maybe I would get gleaned and he wouldn't. That doesn't seem like a very good place to live to me.
Again, Scythe is quite a complex book. I think coming down as a hard agree or a hard disagree on that quote is quite hard. I think most people would be somewhere in the middle. But thank you for the question, Samantha. Our next question comes from Megan. So for Tess, are there any dystopian titles which you read growing up, which you've returned to as an adult, and maybe had a slightly different experience with?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. I think that, so some of them I haven't reread. I watched the Maze Runner series recently, and to tell the truth, I don't think that it did justice to the books so far. The books for Maze Runner by James Dashner are another series that I would really recommend, that are brilliant and a lot of fun to read back to. And I think that they raise a lot of questions about pandemics in the future and the lengths that we would go to kind of do research for pandemics and prevent them from happening. I shouldn't say any more because that could start to spoil the books, but it's quite a big theme in these books. And yeah, I think that that's one that I have come back to thinking about recently that's had a big impact because, of course, with the global pandemic, we're thinking about, okay, what lengths do we go to currently to try to prevent disease and to make sure that our vaccines work and stuff like that. So I think that having that kind of a view back on the Maze Runner has been really interesting for me.
Yes, very nice. I think just from my own perspective, I agree that the Maze Runner is a great series. Yeah, I highly recommend you to go and have a read. Our next question comes from James. Basically, what James is asking is regarding the function of the Scythe. So the population in the book, just as some context, is still growing. And Scythe Curie at one point mentions that she would be very scared of how many people they'd have to glean if they were just determined to keep the population stable. And James wants to know, why do they let the population keep growing? Even if the Thunderhead is able to theoretically cater for more people, why might that be the case?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So it seems like there is this kind of built-in idea of the Thunderhead can take more capacity and make Earth livable for more and more people. But we can imagine that that should be finite. I mean, even if you have really this all-powerful Thunderhead that's looking after everyone, there's literally only so much space on the planet. And I think there were a couple of sections where they talked about failed colonization attempts.
Yeah, failed Moon and Mars colonizations do get a mention towards the start.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's really interesting, because it seems to me that as the human population grows, if you had it continuing to grow like that, eventually you would have to expand out into space, because there simply wouldn't be enough space on planet Earth to support all of those people. And I guess the reluctance around keeping the population down in this setting is because when in a world where so few people die, it must seem like a very big deal. The way that we see it presented in the book, it must seem like a very big deal to have a family member gleaned. And I suppose that if you're inflicting that kind of suffering on these family members, sure, the Scythes try to make up for it by granting immunity and stuff like that. But at the same time, that's still a lot to take away from a family. And I think that that just reflects that there's been some compassionate thought about what death still means in that society.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Eva, and she wants to know what part of the book, or at least from the parts you've read so far, made you think the most, and why?
Well, actually, I'm not sure about a part of the book plot-wise. I've been really enjoying it, but there was one particular entry from Scythe Curie's journal that was my favorite. And I don't have the direct quote, but I have a little note written down about it. And that was, it was one of the ones where Scythe Curie talks about whether actually the loss of death for most people in this future world, whether that's actually sucked some of the humanity away from us. She talks about how people in this future world don't have a proper understanding or appreciation for the mortal world literature, the pre-immortal world literature, because there's not much of an understanding of what was the force of the emotions back then and why were people feeling so much. So they can't grasp literature, and even love seems to be different. She says something like, love is still mortal, even though we're immortal. And I think that really brought home the bioethical questions for me, and really kind of hit me hard. That was, really eye-opening to think about how a lot of what we might appreciate today and a lot of what we might feel today might be in part influenced by the fact that we know we only have so long.
Just to throw my own 2 cents in, unfortunately, I also didn't have time to read the book its entirety, but I did make a good effort. And there's a few bits that I found quite thought-provoking and enjoyable, but particularly, I think it's quite interesting to hear just how the machinations of how the Scythe sort of society works, because in a world where so much of it seems very strange and unfamiliar, they still have their own traditions. They, like washing their hands to kind of free them of the blood of all the people they've killed, metaphorically. And yeah, I think that's quite interesting to see some semblance of humanity in a very inhuman world. So I think we have time for one last question. And this comes from Connor. So he wants to know, why do you think that the Scythes are separated from normal human life?
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good question. So why are the Scythes separated from the rest of the people? Some of it seems to come down to fear and the way that they're treated when they go out into normal society. This fear of a Scythe seems like fear of death, but amplified because death is no longer normal. And I suppose that that's one of the reasons why that seems to make sense. But then you might have been thinking, Connor, about also this fact that they seem to be separated from society and to some extent like higher than society as well. They're put up on a pedestal because they have this power over, maybe not life, well, power over life and death, at least at the end of life. And that's something that maybe we put people in our society up on pedestals partly for that reason too. So we do have a lot of respect for people who have control over other people's lives, judges who can decide when people are going to prison or not, doctors who can, heal the sick or not. And I suppose this is like almost an amplification of this, that when those are the only people that have that kind of power, they're treated as something different.
Thank you very much. So sadly, that does conclude today's session. So Tess, I'd like to thank you so much for taking part, and also for our audience for sending in their questions. If you haven't already submitted your book reviews on Scythe via the Oxplore site, then again, you can have a chance to win the full Arc of a Scythe trilogy. If you do that, the deadline is at the end of October, and we've seen a bunch of fantastic ones so far. So do keep those coming. I'd also like to announce the winner of the prize draw for attending today's book club live session. And our competition winner is Rihanna from Downton School. So thank you very much. You've won the full trilogy, and we will be in touch with your teacher to arrange your prize. So our next book club live session is going to be in November, and we're focusing on Northern Lights by Philip Pullman from His Dark Materials. And I'm delighted to say that Philip Pullman himself will be our special guest for this discussion. So that's November 24th, same time, 4 till 4:40 p.m. Going to be a really exciting one. Do join us for that. We'd also remind you to visit the Oxplore Book Club resource page on the website for quizzes, articles, author profiles, and much more. And do keep an eye on our social media channels for all the latest updates. That's at Let's Oxplore on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. That also has an events page, so if you do want more details about how to sign up for our next book club live event, have a check of that. So thank you all once again for attending, and we hope that you enjoyed, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.